Great. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. Again, I want to thank Alex Pandel from 18F, a UX designer and product strategist, for joining us, as well as Chach Sykes, who is a designer and front-end engineer at Maplight. And I've known both of these folks for a number of years now. They are stalwarts in the civic and government technology space, and really it's a delight to have you here to talk about civic design and what it means to you. So I was hoping we can start with a little bit of your background, what you've done in the past, how you ended up where you are now, and then we'll take it from there. Chach, do you want to start?
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. So I am a programmer and designer. I've been building technology since HTML. I learned of HTML in 1995. About 10, 12 years ago, I worked at the Exploratorium as an exhibit developer, and that introduced me to public design, designing for museum audiences, and ignited my interest in making complicated ideas understandable. And later on, maybe 5 years ago, I spent a lot of time involved with open source technology, and then I was a Code for America fellow in the first year, 2011, and I was really excited about the opportunity to bring what I learned in museums and this sciences to the civic realm, and that's been true. It's been really enjoyable, and so I've worked at a company where we publish information on building permits with Alex, and now I work on a voting information product for Californians and people in Illinois and New York at Maplight and with the League of Women Voters of California. This is Alex.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I am Alex Pandel. I am currently at 18F, and if some of you haven't heard of 18F, we are a digital consultancy inside the federal government for the federal government. So I'm a federal employee, and our team partners with other federal agencies to help those agencies build, buy, and share digital services better. And so I've been there for about, I think 8 months or something now, working on a whole bunch of different projects, focusing mostly on UX design and product strategy. So running a lot of design workshops, doing a lot of user research, that kind of stuff. Before that, I was running a civic startup called Civic Insight that Chach was working with me on for a couple of years. And we worked to make information about buildings, and particularly how buildings are changing over time. So building permits, code violations, all of that kind of information easier for the public and other interested parties to actually understand what's going on. And that project came to be during my Code for America Fellowship in 2012. And so I was partnering with the city of New Orleans through Code for America, which is an organization that pairs designers and developers from the private sector with city governments for a year to see what's possible with new technology. And our project lived on and turned into a company and was acquired about a year ago. So that's how I'm here, how I got here, and I'm happy to pass it back, Yeah,
well, a couple of things there. Code for America.
Yeah.
And success is possible with government technology.
Yeah.
You're at a company that was acquired by Excella, if that's correct, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we had Max from Excella here a couple
Cool.
weeks ago to talk about business models and whatnot.
Nice.
So, so we're talking about civic design, and design is a long-standing discipline that exists far outside of civics. So, to give a little context, what excites you about design in the context of government services in particular?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like I kind of feel like we all gravitate towards government because there's so much room for impact. Like, you're working on problems that are really critical to society and better functioning of how humans interact with each other. So I feel like that's what drew me to this space, was the ability to actually affect people's lives in a really meaningful way. This sort of byproduct that's been really interesting once I kind of arrived in the government space was realizing how much room for growth there is. Encountering really like motivated and excited people inside government who want to do the right thing but are like hindered by these really antiquated processes or restrictions. There's like a lot of opportunity for creativity, I feel like, and trying to navigate like real constraints. Whereas sometimes, you know, if like the sky's the limit, it can get kind of boring. But when there are serious like policy constraints you have to navigate, or crazy technology, like infrastructure problems that you have to work through and take into account, it makes the work really interesting. So that's how I'm drawn to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, I often come across this feeling of like wanting to be helpful. I definitely find that this work continues to be relevant. I noticed that I never really have to try very hard to explain to other people like why it matters, because people are like, yeah, thank God you're doing that. Thank you. Somebody like keep doing it. Right. And so, and also, you know, it's for me, like the bureaucrat, like I'll probably talk more about bureaucratic language. And for me, it's like this, you know, like deep anxiety that we have as a society around like understanding like what these processes are. And I think anything we can, like using design to improve and translate between citizens and you know, the services of government to give people the ability to make decisions more solidly. I think that like it leads to empowerment of citizens, better decisions, and then even like for the future, like resilience, like as, you know, I think about like climate, you know, like more like crises and disasters, and like how are we going to be ready for that if we can not make, you know, if we're having like struggles communicating. So I think design's role in facilitating and smoothing out our translations among each other is like really important, and so I'm really excited, you know, for any opportunity for that to make an impact in that area.
Thanks. And I think the teams we have here as part of Stardom Residents are doing just that. So it's exciting to hear that's a motivation for you. And I'll please ask the folks here in the room and those on the live stream to chime in with questions anywhere along the way. Type them into the YouTube chat, and we'll be leaving plenty of room. I have a couple questions queued up, but really want to make this interactive to address the needs that you have. Yeah, so right off the bat.
As you brought it up, Alex, how constraining do you feel it is, like the codes and the policies to be creative? Like, I know you have a lot of laws around like privacy. You also have constraints such as you have to be able to reach out with whatever ability it has to be able to reach out to the whole populace. So you can't do something that's too technical or too. So how, in terms of like your creative aspect that you bring to the table, how constraining is that, and what are some ways you can, you know, deal with those issues?
Yeah.
So just let me repeat that question.
Yeah.
How difficult are the constraints, and how do you balance that with creativity, and maybe some examples?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It kind of depends on the situation. Like, the constraints are real, but I think what's really interesting is like what an opportunity that we have actually to examine those policies more closely. Like it kind of creates this opportunity for there to be light light being shined on, like, oh, okay, this is a policy that's like really affecting this service that you want to like put forth for your constituents. Let's make sure that that policy is actually like, are we interpreting it in a way that is actually like getting to what it was originally put in place to do? Like, there's a lot of like opportunity for sort of looking into how the regulations are actually being interpreted, and realizing a lot of times like, oh, some of there are all these levels that I should know as a federal employee, but it's something like there's law, and then there's regulation, and then there's like guidance, and then there's like, where there's sort of levels of how strict the rules are, and realizing that something that actually is like guidance is being treated as law. And it's like, oh, actually, this is something where we have some flexibility, and maybe we could write some language around it that will make it possible for us to use a slightly different approach that allows for more modern practices to be a part of the way we work. I'm trying to think if I have an example. I'm curious, do you have any examples? And because I feel like I'd have to jog my mind to think of some.
And maybe this is a good segue into the first question I had, which
Yeah.
is describing some ways in which designing for government differs from other types of product design.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, but then I want to pass it to you too. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so kind of what I was just saying, one of the things that's really interesting in government is that a lot of times a process change can be as valuable and as difficult as like creating a new product or making an actual technological change. And it's sort of like this mental shift for technology folks to be like, I'm spending all this time like fighting with this regulation or this policy, when really that is super critical to making space for improvements in technology in the long run. So it can feel like you're like wasting a lot of time fighting up against constraints, when really like that work sort of sets the stage for that government agency that you're working with to do things in a different way moving forward. So like you're actually making a much bigger impact than you think, and like the tension that you're enduring is totally worth it. So that's an interesting difference. Like in the private sector, a lot of times it's like, don't worry about process, just like make the thing. And it's like, in this case, sometimes wrestling through those processes is really important. Another really obvious one is like accessibility is not optional in government. Like you really have to build in ways that are accessible for everyone. And I think that's really cool, because I think everything should be that way, but like we can kind of get away in the private sector without paying as much attention to people with special needs. And, you know, like I've heard really cool stories at 18F where people like get to expand their skill sets in having to think about, oh my God, how is this entire complex website going to be navigated by voice? Like what is this going to sound like? Holy crap, like this is a new way I get to think about my work. So those are a couple. I have like a million more, but I want to see what you have to say.
Yeah, so I think for me, what I've noticed, the language used, I think about this a lot. So when I would assume in your work you're embedded with governments and you're learning like these processes that are very complex and for a lot of different reasons, and that you're serving professional audiences who are like, you know, you're helping them with a workflow that existed, and then also maybe there's like a part of it that interfaces with the citizens that are participating in whatever service that is. And it's really like, it's similar to the process, is like pushing on the words, because it's the legalese that are like, well, we call this thing this specific thing because that has meaning. It has meaning to engineers that like in the building permit process, like there's a lot of different words that if you study engineering in school, like you're a professional, these are the professional words that you learned, and this is your training. Like water infrastructure, like just basically like everything that is like legit and serious, and like how do you actually like take care of the streets, or like you know, toilets in buildings, or you know, just like random different things. Those things are all really serious, but we also, because you can be like, the more you learn, that's an acculturation process. Citizens don't know those things, and what I found so interesting in working with the MapLight and then the League of Women Voters, because they are always like, they have they're an organization that has a history of like radically like so accessible and so interested in inclusion, so they take it really, really seriously. And so I've gotten to do a lot of this like the same, you know, like really accessible design work, and you know, like there's reading level and like cognition that comes into what you share with the public. And I think it's really interesting that, like as civic designers, it's the words and language that, and like content design, content strategy that come up like over and over again, because like, as I like to explain to people when I think about this, a bureaucracy is a culture, and you learn this. You teach it, you're all in the process of learning it, and or you learn it in school. And that is non-intuitive. It's not like scientific information, which, is more like measurement based. It's completely subjective, and words are the medium that is used to convey relationships between people. And so words are really important. There's also like design, like visual design elements, and also, other like flow issues that come up, but I really like think about words like basically all the time, and it's like ignited my interest in words and my admiration of journalists and copywriters and grammar and everything. Like I'm just like, wow, this is amazing. So I'm pretty, that's what I like.
So we need to know words to design for government.
Yeah, I have some tips for later.
And I think we have a question on it to follow up
sure.
on that.
Okay,
Please go
cool.
ahead.
Yeah, I thought of a concrete example to respond to your question around, like, this was something actually on a project that we both worked on together that kind of ties into what Chach was just talking about language. Like, there was sort of this constant back and forth with the first city that we worked with at my company, Civic Insight, which we were working with during my Code for America Fellowship, which was the city of New Orleans. And we were originally trying to make it easy for a regular citizen to understand, like, what the heck is the process for an abandoned, falling down building to actually, like, not be abandoned and falling down? Like, where is this particular property in that process, and what is that process overall? And like Chach said, like, all of the words that were being used in the city were like these, official, government-y, architect-y words that like regular people don't understand, like adjudication and abatement. And it was like, what are you talking about? And in order to make the case that like that was not usable and that wasn't gonna, like, yes, we could put that information on a website, but it's still not actually gonna solve the need of like helping citizens know what's going on so that they don't call the city constantly and ask questions. Like, actually, I feel like the piece of advice is like, everything has to have a super strong connection to the user. And if you can actually demonstrate to your city partners, like, this doesn't work for the people you're trying to serve, like, they fundamentally don't understand what you're talking about. So even if we make a pretty website, they're still gonna ask you all the same questions if we're not changing the words. And what was so interesting is, like, by providing that evidence and that connection to the people that they're actually trying to serve, we were able to, like, the city then not only said, okay, let's try these crazy new words, like, step 1 or step 2, I can't even remember what we used, but like very simple. They also then started to question, wait, why are we using these complicated words internally? And actually ended up changing the way they sort of structured their internal system so that the statuses were plain language as well, which was like a really cool example of what I was talking about before, where like pushing back on the way things are can often have a like side benefit for the government as well, not just like the constituents that they're trying to serve, but like you can actually make the processes internally easier as well. So it's worth fighting the fight and using the plain words, and a really useful tool in that fight is having everyone have exposure to the user's experience. So, yeah.
So we have a question from?
Yeah, so I'll ask it and then
Yeah.
just repeat it. Not surprisingly, there's a question about RFQs and RFIs. So Binti is saying, especially from 18F's point of view, what would be your advice for a startup doing these for the first time? What would be things you wish you knew? Yeah.
So the question is, what's advice from your perspective on how a startup that's applying to an RFP for the first time should approach that, and any words of advice?
It's rough. And it's interesting, like, because Chach worked with me on this too, like, I was originally working from a local perspective and working with local governments, and it is a little different at the federal level. So, like, y'all are working with cities, so I might, instead of, like, from the 18F perspective, I might be talking more from, like, Civic Insight perspective, because we were working with city governments. It was really tricky. I mean, so a few things that ended up working for us in terms of like navigating that process. I feel like if you're an early stage startup trying to actually like go through the RFP process and compete with like the giant vendors who have 1 million contract lawyers and stuff, it's just not like, don't do that. You're gonna fail. It's too much energy. Like, unless that's what you really want to do and you want to invest and staff up with like proposal writers, don't spend your energy there. I think there are ways to be creative with partnerships in terms of like getting to understand like if your technology or tool or product like has to interact with any other tools that already exist in the city, like getting to know those vendors and what their relationships are like is a really effective way to understand, like, if we're gonna have to integrate with your technology anyway, is there a way we could partner so that if you already have a contract with the city, we could like pilot an add-on or something like that. So like if that technically makes sense, that's always a good way to go. Another thing is like getting to know what a particular city's like procurement thresholds are. Like, I think at a certain level, they can use a charge card. At another level, they just have to like get a competing quote from a couple companies, like maybe 3. And then at another level of pricing, like then they have to do a formal request for proposals, and it's the whole thing, and you have to, you know, prove that you've been in business for so many years and have so much money in the bank and all the things that like rule out startups. So those are some concrete examples. Yeah.
Sorry, can you speak to an RFI or an RFO as well?
What is an RFO? Request for,
Request for offer.
oh God.
So clarification on the question, RFI and RFO, request for information and request for offer. We're getting a little far afield from design,
Okay,
so a
that's
couple
true.
thoughts and then let's pull it back to,
Yeah.
And there is a design question after that.
Okay,
cool.
great, and we'll get back to that one.
Yeah, I don't have as much experience with those. Like, I'm not even quite sure what that entails necessarily. I think we may have tried to participate once in a request for information because it felt like a lighter lift than an RFP. So we were like, okay, sure, we'll give you some information about us. But I think that may have even been in partnership with another vendor that we were working with, which they kind of did most of the lift, and all we had to do was sort of provide more information about our company. So like for us, partnering with other vendors that already have a lot of relationships in government was a huge factor for us being able to really get off the ground. So that is something that's worth approaching if it makes sense for the way your business works and the way your technology works. But I'm curious if you have other thoughts.
What I've noticed, it's probably very limitedly helpful, but the company I work with, they have some partnerships with the Secretary of State that have been exploratory, and also the product I'm working on, the Campaign Finance Board of New York City used it. And I think in the product I'm working on, it's like we've designed a product that's really easy for them to just use, like add a logo, and it's providing the data that they already want, and create it, and like there's like, we have like a voting information section that, I designed it in a really open source way. And the open source model like is still a viable thing, even though like people kind of stopped talking about that for a while, but just want to bring it back. Create some open source technology, governments still like it. And you can sort of like create either like a white label product or something, that you can add like features with like one partner and then another and then another. Basically everything I've worked on has had a model like that. I mean, that might just be my skill set, like is really well adapted to that process, but it's just exactly what you said about partnerships, finding like one small problem that is really helpful, which it sounds like you probably are already doing, learning as much as you can of how to be helpful, and then creating something that also helps some other governments. But again, you're probably doing that.
So I want to go back to the idea of designing for government staff as well as end users and citizens. A little of this conversation is designing your business model for government staff and for RFPs. So, but that's a sort of organizational, business level conversation. But as far as design work, you talked a little bit about the need to balance the conversation and normalize between how citizens think about a service and how government staff think about that service. So I'd love to hear more thoughts on that and any tools that you've used to help with that process? Any specific tools that could help to normalize design around those two audiences?
I'm going to say a technology thing, and then I'm going to share some design ideas. But also, in addition to the bureaucratic language of culture, there's also a whole thing around data and technology. Because I am an engineer, also, I work with data all of the time, and you are probably working with data too. And if you think about it, the history of like how governments, get technology, adopt it. They can be great champions and like keep data for a long time. Engineers, computer programmers, and others often, they think to compress ideas into something that works in a table or, that can be stored in a computer. And then we wind up with these like legacy systems that sometimes are like, well, we have to call it abatement because that's what the field is, and we can't change it because that's like $80 million. So we better call it that. And I think that is where some of the tension does come from. And that, as a designer engineer, the thing that I really fight against is it's so much easier to just be efficient. But that, as a design experience, that efficiency is the thing that's like heartless and cold, and people react to it and they don't like it, and they're like, no, this doesn't fit with my life. And so that tension is really real. And so it comes not just from the law, but it also is dictated in your software architecture, especially like old data systems. And so simplifying, streamlining before you solidify something, like just pushing on it just to make sure that it's easy, like early on, has like payoff like way later, because you don't have all these people like having to relearn. You don't have these like every time there's a startup, they have to ask like a million questions to understand like the basics. So before you can even design anything. So I think that's really important. And then design-wise, like, user testing is amazing. If you ever need, like, advice that we got in our training was, if you videotape people being confused, if people never don't believe you, videotape people being confused and then show it, because it's like seeing other people struggle is always more like people don't, they kind of believe you, but they don't necessarily believe you. But if they see people like having, it's like that, it activates their empathy, and then they're like, oh, yeah, this is a problem. This is not why we are in this job. Like we want to be helpful too. And so you're opening that up. Yeah, and I have a story for later, but so we'll come back to more like user testing related things. But here.
Yeah, I mean, Chach kind of nailed it. Like, I was just going to talk almost exclusively about, like, the impact that, like, exposure to users actually experiencing a system or process or tool or whatever is sort of, I think, the key to sort of bridging the, like, government staff experience and the end user experience. The thing I also wanted to say about this is, when you originally, like, shared this question with me, I was sort of curious if you meant, like, does this mean when you're designing where the government staff is the end user versus when the constituent is the end user, or is it about the conflict between, and it sounds like it's more the latter, like the conflict between if you are designing for constituents, but your partner is the government staff. It's more that scenario, right?
Yeah, because there can be internal systems that the end user is solely government
Right.
staff.
And in that case, like, I would say, there's no problem or difference. Yeah, it's like you're treating them as the user, and great, you're
but
done.
I think a lot of folks here, not all, but they're designing tools that are public facing.
Yep.
So there's, at the very least, two personas.
Yeah.
Government users and then citizens.
Yeah.
And that's the tension I think that can arise. That it's,
Yes.
You need to satisfy both on some level, so how do you do that?
Right, and I think it's like there's two steps almost. It feels like the first thing is as direct exposure as you can provide for the government staff to the actual user experiencing the process as it is, or the tool, like, is gold. Because then, like, the second step is like that, like, what that does is it establishes a shared understanding of the problem, and the user has their own constraints, like their own mental models about how they look at things, and then the government staff have their own constraints too. But, like, if you are both on the same page about what the user's experience is, then you can have a more productive conversation with the staff about like, well, but it says abatement in the thing and it's going to cost $80 million to do it. And it's like, okay, well, is there a way we can add a layer on top of that and have the word be changed in that layer so that, we can accommodate both needs. Yeah. Yeah.
So question?
So this question comes from Krista Kanalakis.
Oh.
And she wanted me to first say that she thinks you're both awesome. And that
We love you, Krista.
wanted to participate with them on live streams to the 21st century.
Such a Krista comment.
Real quick, Krista Kanalakis from Mayor's Office of Civic Innovation in San Francisco says these two are awesome. We agree, and that live stream is so 21st century.
Thank you. So the question is, how do you convince people in government that design is important?
How do you convince people in government that design is important?
In some ways, they already know that it is. For one of the later questions, I was going to give an example of something that I like, and I think that like a curb cut. Have you heard of a curb cut before? For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's the thing in the street where it kind of like gradually like connects to the street. Like the slope and the ramp. Before civic design, like when I worked in science museums, universal design was like the cool thing. And that is, designing for everyone, and like accessibility is really important. And, they talk about how, they designed it for one reason, but then it wound up serving multiple purposes. And I liken that to when you talk about like open data, open like transparency around your processes. Like the curb cut was, that designed before, segways and like hoverboards, skateboards, strollers at the same time. But you design something that like works for a lot of reasons, and then other things like society keeps changing. And so there are already designers like in government, like that's basically what they do, like fundamentally all the time, like solving problems. For convincing them, it's like the videos thing, and then user testing, and then bringing people, like training in other people in the user testing process and bringing them in. It's really easy to do and really lightweight. But just seeing people struggle and be really confused or lost, I think is like really magical and helpful.
Yeah, not a ton to add there. Like, I always say that user exposure is kind of the gateway drug to design in government, I feel like. It's like, if you can get, we would often actually invite, like, you can record sessions, you can also just invite a stakeholder to, like, be your note taker during a user session, and then they get that, like, firsthand experience in the room of, like, watching the struggle. And I can't remember what I was going to say after that. But that's a good little tidbit. If I think of the next thing, I'll come back to it.
Good question, Krista. So we'll get back to another question, but you were talking about examples of good civic design, so we might as well go there. If you have any projects you've worked on or projects you've seen that exemplify civic design principles,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear them.
Okay, I thought of a story that I think will be really,
It's story
really good, and
time.
it's new, and so maybe you haven't heard about this. Okay, so whenever you talk about civic design, you may have heard of the Center for Civic Design, and they have these like cool like field guides to civic design. It's like this really cool free online PDF printout. They have, that is like something that we were trained in, and they did analysis of like voting information and ballots to understand like comprehension, and then made a lot of recommendations that are just like regular design in terms of like layout. And then the like Gov UK has like really good style guidelines around design. So all of that's like really useful. And this year, the League of Women Voters, and I think the Center for Civic Design, and maybe some other people, don't quote me, I should know, but I may not be like perfectly quoting it, but they designed this thing called the Voting Bill of Rights, which is a one-page printout where that eventually, it was like signed into law that this Voters Bill of Rights needed to be plain language. and they, in their process, like it was made available, and if you live in California, you got a voting guide. It was like one of the first page, and then they also designed it to hand out in line when people were voting. But they took the way it had been written in legalese, and then they did a process, like they went to like a lot of like government meetings and people, and they workshopped, they iterated on the text and the copy, like they talked to like 86 people, and got it down and then negotiated. So like words like, they're like, if you see any fraudulent activity, they changed that to if you see a crime. So just much simpler. And then that has the added benefit too, because in addition to accessibility, language access is like super important, and you are inevitably going to face this. And so plain language copy is much easier to translate into other languages. It's shorter, it's faster, and then when it's like simpler to translate, which can be less expensive, less expensive. And then the reading level is just like for comprehension. So I think that that guide, I find that really inspiring, and I love that it's like a law. They're like, you have to make sense. So.
Yeah, that's awesome, because that's like one of the examples I always think of too. And so, yay. A project that I think is really cool that 18F worked on that I didn't work on at all, but I just am always like fangirling about this project is the Federal Elections Commission is responsible for providing information about where, like, campaign finance and like where money is coming from and going to in terms of like the political process. And 18F has been working with FEC for a while and it's interesting because it's like one of these agencies where most of what they do can be accomplished through a website. So like redesigning their website has actually been this fascinating process of kind of redesigning the way that agency works. Because it's like that's their gateway to the public, and that's how everyone comes in. And some things that were really key to getting that project off the ground is like some like political context is it's a commission, Federal Election Commission, and the commissioners are inherently, like by design, always in conflict kind of. And so getting them to approve experimenting in a new way, releasing things in the public before they're completely done, like that was all super scary. And so the team was really creative about how can we like break off the smallest chunk that we can, it was sort of this cycle, I mean, it's like Agile in a nutshell, honestly, but like break off a small piece, get the stakeholders on board to take the risk of putting that piece out in the public. And at first they were like, oh, we want to do the first iteration of the website. And they're like, oh, that's too much. Like, that's where everybody sees us. The press can see that. So they were like, okay, well, what if we start with just the API? So the only people who are really going to be looking at this are like the data geeks already, but it shows that like we're thinking of doing things in a new way. And they then got a ton of great feedback from that community that like, oh my God, this API is great. Like we can actually access this. We can do stuff with this data. Finally, we haven't been able to this whole time. And that kind of shifted the mindset of the stakeholders inside of the agency who were like, oh, okay, like releasing small things is okay. And like people are receiving that well. So then once they got the first iteration of the website out, it was the same thing. Like obviously there was some feedback of like, oh, well, this still doesn't make sense. But like the general feedback was like, oh, this is awesome. And that helped build the trust within the agency to take bigger risks and be more willing to invest in a new way of doing things. And obviously like the content was a total redesign so that it was all plain language because it was all legalese at first. So all of the like classic design principles were how the work was being done. But there's this like underlying layer of getting your partner on board with even employing any of those standard design principles that I think is like the tricky piece with government is it's like you can't just say this is the way design works and you should just go for it. It's like you actually have to prove why doing things in a new way is valuable, and like the smaller the experiment you can run and the more you can get like evidence that it worked by exposing them to the user's reaction is like really critical, I feel like.
Tiny things. One thing that I saw, I don't know if it was on that site or another one, as an open source person, I remember when the White House had done their first like commit to an open source code base, and we were like, whoa, that's so weird. But that was like 7 or 8 years ago. And then I noticed that 18F finally, was like doing this on a regular basis. And they put in the very top part of their page, like, we're working in the open, which I thought was, I like found that fascinating. And it reminded me too that part of design is failing a lot and trying things that just sort of like push the edge. And it's like you have to, like, you get it till you sort of like, you're like, oh, no, that's too far. And then like reel it back in. But that is like risk. And if you are in a perfection culture, which is like kind of like all of like industrial American history, is like, get it right, you guys, come on. Don't make a mistake. Like, we learned that in school. Like, that is the opposite of what it takes to like really understand like how do things work. And so what you're describing too, and you might like come up with different ways to do this in your careers, but you're making space to do the design. When I worked at the Exploratorium, we would have like a prototyping area where visitors could interact with things, and sometimes it's like a little unsafe or something. So you need to have like someone there. Like when we did the Market Street Prototyping Festival, which was like on Market Street, it was like 50 different like installations, which this was like 3 days, and you would think, oh, wow, that could be like a really dangerous like public safety issue, because you have all these people that like they're not architects building things. But the city worked to make it safe and like dealt with the permitting to create an area for experimentation, and we need that experimentation. So everything that we do, we like carve out these places where it's okay to investigate and understand and learn from it, and like have that sort of like, that's really interesting that people like really don't understand what I assume to be true. So like that, I think that's like super important.
Yeah, and along those lines, I've been inspired to see New York City and Boston both put up a prototype, an alpha version of their website that's purely for experimentation, and just to see what people do with it, what kind of feedback they get, and to carve out that space to listen and learn, which is really brave. And they don't put it on the front page of nyc.gov or whatever it is, but it's there and in the public eye. Yeah. So great. We have time for questions. Want to go to the room before we go back to the live stream? Yeah, please.
I was just going to back up for a minute or ask a little more, kind of 30,000 feet. Just based on your experience and maybe like some best practices that you've developed, like not to be too broad, but just maybe like what are 3 kind of really important things to do when you approach user research and user testing when you're redesigning a current platform? And I don't know if that would be different from designing from scratch or not. It could be.
Great. So the question is, taking a step back, and this was actually the last question I have, so you jumped. This is perfect. Is when you think we're all on the same page, which is lovely. Yeah, we're all working together. So when you think about design from a broader, higher level perspective, what are 3 best practices or tools that you use for user research or user-centered design?
What are 3 important things to do to make sure that you do when you do the user research and subsequently user testing?
3 important things to do when doing user research and user testing.
I can take some. So make a hypothesis of like what you think you're going to learn. Like, why are you doing this, and what do you think you might learn? That way you can be surprised. But if you didn't have like some structure, if you might not. And I think it's like helpful to like, we think we're going to learn this thing. It's knowing where you're, like if you're going to be inviting other people to look at like your prototypes or whatever, there is like a sort of like coordination of like people's schedules and like calendars and where are they going to be and when, and the sort of hospitality. You can do a lot, and and like you also have a, like, since it's really relevant work, and you have the benefit of it's probably for like a lot of people in general, or it's like with a particular department, so you might not have as hard of a time finding users as if it were like some other niche. make sure that you give yourself time to really like do that outreach, to get, get a good list of people who might be interested in helping you, so you can do it like more often. And also like it's really, if it's the sort of perfection culture of like, it's like sort of like old waterfall, pre-agile, like get it right. You want to like impress your funders and stakeholders. You might be like, well, we can only do one round of user testing. But it's actually like if you sort of just get over the hump and like learn how to do it, you can do it on like an afternoon. Like we've been doing that, not like always, but like in phases. Like we're able to do it like every like 2 weeks or every month. And then there was the city of Asheville designed this like project called Simplicity, and it was the government staff doing user testing, and they went out like I think every month to a coffee shop. But you can also go to the public library if you set it up in advance, bring like snacks, and sort of like you can like get people, they really do like to help, so especially they know like what benefit it is. I think that's more than 3 things.
Yeah, those are all awesome. And I'm trying to like only say other ones that Chach didn't already cover. But I feel like kind of what you were just getting at is, in addition to like acknowledging that there are going to be some logistics involved, like it's worth it to add the logistical burden to yourself to meet the users where they are, as much as you can see like where they would be interacting with the product or service or whatever naturally, like the better you can understand the context in which they are experiencing things, and like understand why certain things are problems, which might be harder to replicate if like they come into your office. And sometimes like that also makes them nervous. Like being at City Hall is like, ooh, I feel like I'm being tested, So yeah, like they're not wrong. Yes, it's not user testing, it's usability testing. But yeah, something else, so like, okay, if you can, meet the users where they are. If you can, bring a stakeholder with you, but don't let them lead. Like their job, like give them a job, like they're taking notes, and like, loop them into like the research methodology that like, one person plays the lead role and another person carefully takes notes, but then that way they get to experience it, and like we talked about, that's like really critical. And then something else, like kind of what you were saying about like the perfectionist culture and like we're gonna do a usability study. Like some research is better than no research. Like, a government often is gonna ask you like, well, what is the statistically significant percentage of humans that we have to talk to? And like, yes, ideally you would do that, but like talking to 3 or 4 people is better than talking to 0 people. And like, that doesn't sound very scientific, but sometimes I've had success with just saying that. It's like, if we have no information, there's no way we're gonna do a better job than if we have some information. So that can be an important thing to like get go through the gateway or whatever you said, like get started. And then once they see, oh, this is actually not that hard, it can then become a regular practice. But yeah, the hypothesis thing is super important. So just emphasizing like, know what you're trying to find out. Like don't just go in and be like, what do you think? Do you like this? Because yeah, but this is like, that's like 101 and you are all beyond that, so yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that, write down your assumptions about what you think will happen,
Yeah.
so that you can avoid them.
Yes.
and be neutral. And that's related to providing a safe space
Yes.
for people to just give you their genuine reaction.
Yep.
And then this is sort of getting out of our heads, which is hard. So if you do that work ahead of time,
Yeah.
just brain dump, like, well, this is what I think is going to happen, you can kind of have a little bit more leeway room to get around it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. More questions from the room? More questions from online? Okay, we'll come back to you. Let's go back to...
Okay, so this is from Herman of Community Logic. In your opinion, how important was designing UX, et cetera, in Civic Insight gaining more clients?
So,
Also want to say we have about 5 to 7 minutes.
okay, great. So Herman from Vancouver asks, via our live stream, how important was design in civic actions getting traction with new clients?
Yeah, so huge. That was kind of our main selling point, honestly. Like we were basically a nicer interface on top of systems that government already had. So like design was our primary selling point, more or less. It was like, you are getting phone calls, questions, your staff is having to spend a bunch of their time like actually asking you what this stuff means, and if you were actually able to present that information in a way that those questions could be answered automatically just through an interface that made sense, that would reduce burden on you. And that was like literally the pitch, more or less. So design was really critical. I'm happy to go into more detail, but since we have a short amount of time, like, and also Chach could probably, if you wanted to speak to that, Chach was one of our designers at Civic Insight, so had a big hand in that.
In other projects that I've seen, it's been the same way. The project I'm working on now, that we are doing user testing, people are like, yes, awesome. I think people have heard of it and that they're ready for that process and know that that's like a good sign of health in a project.
Side note, Seamless Docs, which is had a large amount of investment over the last couple of years and penetrated the market to a great degree. Their CEO founders like, we want to make government more beautiful. Right. So that's, you can't have more of a direct sort of design angle than that. Right. It's a beautiful user interface. Great. Question in the room.
What are the insights from your exploratorium work that we can incorporate? Shared some, but I'm sure.
Yeah.
Insights from the exploratorium work. Yes.
Yes. That it's complicated. That like when I did that work, public understanding of science was a whole movement because NSF-funded scientists write papers that people question their relevance because they don't understand what it meant. Like our job was pretty much, it was like nanoscience is this new thing. Nobody knows what it is. What is it? And so we had to like experiment with like all different kinds of ways to help people understand this like really complex thing that you can't see. Government is the same way, and like for me, that's why I really like this, because it's like it's a thing that it really affects us. It affects like every single thing. It's like our health, like for real. And so understanding complexity in like civilization is like that is like everything that, but like applied to real life.
Great. Well, any parting thoughts for our audience before we wrap up? I like the question about specific tips or tricks or anything else that inspires you from your day-to-day. Anything in your notes that you didn't have a chance to share?
I want to kind of talk about election day for a second.
Sure.
I think it's a funny example. I mean, I think maybe we're like reiterating the same point over and over again, but just one more example. When I didn't, like when I started working on like voting information about a year ago. And I remember actually Alex and I were like, wait, there was voting day? Like it was like in some weird month, like June. And we're like, oh no. And I was like, oh, and I felt like really ashamed because I was like, oh no, I'm like Miss Civic. I should know when voting day is. But I'm a transplant, like I moved here from somewhere else, but granted like a long time ago. And then over the course of the last year, I've learned that there's actually like, it's going to be like up to like 14 election days in California. And then I learned that there was like a cool technology project to like, will push you notifications of like when your election day is. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. I want to sign up. I think that's so great. But then I learned of this other organization that was promoting this idea of like, why don't we just change it and make it simple? We'll just have one, maybe two. It's like you vote on this day or the other one. And I was like, oh yeah, because that would be like more like how I grew up and like what I expect. And so, it's just like with cities and the like government technology, it is like our culture. It stresses us out, like it really matters. And there are like certain expectations of like how it should be. And so like there's technology solutions, but wherever you can, like even like pushing on like fund, like going up, like fix the law, those changes, like they do, I've seen over the last few years, like it does make ripples, and it spreads, like the government, they love to federate, which means like to spread and share like their ideas. And so when you do that, like those make big changes, and that's like really exciting because you're like really making like a difference. Like like technology is cool, but like these sort of like culture changes are like amazing.
Yeah, and one last thing that I find is an interesting, like, kind of contrast point or emphasis in when you're designing in the government space versus designing elsewhere, that is like the stress cases or the edge cases are really extreme and like really impactful on people's lives. Like a lot of times, you know, an interaction with government that goes poorly is like really detrimental on someone's well-being or quality of life. So like something that I tend to think about is like sometimes you'll hear people say like, well, design for the average case, but I almost find in government it's helpful to sort of sniff out what are the extreme cases, and if you can design for like this end of the spectrum and this end of the spectrum, automatically anyone in the middle is probably going to be covered, but that way you're not forgetting the fact that like if you're on the IRS website and you're thinking about your taxes, like there's money at stake, there's a chance of getting audited at stake, and like someone might be feeling really scared. So like that interaction is like really important. And that kind of like feeds into why I think this work is meaningful, is because like each interaction can have a really big impact on someone's well-being. It's not like, oh, my food delivery got to my house like 5 minutes slower than it would have with some other app. It's like my well-being is at stake, like the building next to me is going to collapse, or something, like I'm going to get audited and like have to pay hundreds and thousands of dollars to like deal with some crazy thing. So it's important to kind of make sure you understand the extremes and like make sure those are accounted for.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both.
Yeah.
We're going to take a 10-minute break or so, and then we're going to have a session on building government technology and accessibility from the good folks at DT and what they're doing. We heard a little bit about accessibility from you both, so really critical topic. I think Alex and Chach will stick around for a little while if you want questions.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
all.
having us.
And
Thank you so much.